Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. Part 20. Bludgeons and Bowstrings. Trouble was brewing in New Lyxia. Mytildes had created a commercial empire that dominated the economy and made him by far the richest man in the kingdom. After his death, the businesses he had built were divided between his children. But in practice, leadership of the family was assumed by his widow, Endeis, who continued to coordinate operations behind the scenes. And Endeis' power extended beyond her own family. She had the ear of Lyra, who was the grandmother of Telenos, who was the king of New Lyxia. But Telenos was an infant. In practice, it was Lyra who, reluctantly, stood behind his throne and made his decisions for him. Maintaining that throne required revenue. That required taxes to be levied, and the vast majority of those taxes came from the businesses run by Endeis' children. She who pays the piper calls the tune, and Endeis unobtrusively ensured that the state danced to the music of her choice. This cosy arrangement suited everybody. Endeis and her children got what they wanted, Lyra had an easy life, and as he grew up, Telenos basked in the adoration of the public, which was deeply attached to its king. However, as it is said, all good things must come to an end. In the 155th year of the Common Reckoning, Lyra died. Telenos had grown to manhood and was developing his own ideas of how things should be arranged. Endeis found that her influence at court was reduced. By now she was in her 60s and her energy was failing. 3 years later, in the 158th year of the Common Reckoning, she too passed away. Her position as head of the family was taken by her son-in-law, Diadromes, an ambitious man who lacked her diplomatic skills. Things came to a head later that year. Diadromes had just refurbished his principal residence, embellishing it with much marble and many fountains. Telenos decided that by contrast his palace was looking a little tired. It would not do for the king to be outshone by one of his subjects. So he called in the architects and interior designers. They came up with proposals that were to his liking, but rather expensive. To pay for the work, he doubled the duty on imported cheese. Now, this new tax was welcomed by the local cheesemakers, but it was not welcomed by Diadromes. The new Lyxian elite had developed a liking for halfling cheese. Diadromes' family controlled the shipping trade between Royal Harbour and New Lyxia, and so had a very profitable monopoly on that particular commodity. However, there was a limit to what even the idle nobility of New Lyxia would pay for what, at the end of the day, was a lump of congealed milk, and so Telenos' new tax considerably eroded those profits. Diadromes was not a subtle man. When Telenos' father Lycoris had similarly irritated Mytildes, Lycoris had suddenly perished of food poisoning from a mysterious source. There was nothing mysterious about Telenos' end, although it was sudden. He was dragged from his carriage and bludgeoned to death by members of Diadromes' bodyguard. At the same time, mercenaries hired by Diadromes took control of the royal palace, and Diadromes declared himself the tyrant of New Lyxia. There was some popular opposition to this coup, but it did not last long. A crowd gathered outside the palace, protesting against the change of regime. Diadromes' mercenaries put them mercilessly to the sword. That put an end to that. Anyone who Diadromes considered might resist his rule was arrested and executed without even the pretence of a trial. Thus Diadromes cowed the population and cemented his position. However, not everything went as Diadromes had planned. When he took control of the palace, he had expected to capture Telenos' family. But Telenos' wife Iphis and his infant son Lysonos evaded Diadromes' clutches and fled to Kados, where Telenos' sister Kyra was queen. Now the king of Kados was Kinas, who was a nephew of Endeis. Relying on this familial connection, Diadromes sent a message to Kinas, demanding that Kinas deliver Iphis and Lysonos to him. It may be that Kinas resented being given instructions in this peremptory manner. It may be that he cared less for Diadromes than he did for his wife, who pleaded for the fugitives. It may be that, as a matter of principle and personal interest, he disapproved of regicide. Whatever the reason, he bluntly refused to do Diadromes' bidding and started to raise an army, with the intention of marching on New Lyxia, overthrowing the tyrant, and re-establishing the monarchy by placing Lysonos on the throne. Later that year, Kinas and his army marched down the great river toward New Lyxia. Diadromes marched out to meet him, and the two forces clashed at the Battle of Rushbank Reach. Diadromes was triumphant, and Kinas lost his life. His defeated army retreated back to Kados in disarray. Diadromes did not pursue them. Had he done so, Kados would almost certainly have fallen to him. But he was fearful that if he himself led the army north, New Lyxia would rise in rebellion in his absence, and he was not prepared to hand control of the army to a subordinate, who might use it against him. He therefore led his troops back to New Lyxia, where they paraded through the streets in triumph before a rather small and not noticeably enthusiastic crowd, and sent another messenger to Kados, offering to spare that city in return for the persons of Iphis and Lysonos. His request was once again refused. His bluff having thus been called, Diadromes responded by banning citizens of Kados from New Lyxia, and banning citizens of New Lyxia from any trade with Kados. He announced that those breaking these new regulations would suffer capital punishment. He sent a third messenger north, declaring that these sanctions would remain in force until his previous demands were met. And there matters rested. Kados had only been founded 9 years previously, and its founders were emigrants from New Lyxia. Cultural and economic ties between the two cities were therefore strong, and the Kadamosians suffered some hardship as a result of Diadromes' decree. But they did not waver. Instead, they looked elsewhere for the products that they had previously sourced from New Lyxia, and they found willing suppliers in the dwarves dwelling in the hills to the northwest of the city, who were glad to expand into this new market. In the 160th year of the Common Reckoning, Eldaron Broadleaf led an army of mail-clad elves against the settlement of Bear's End, determined to wage a war of extermination, to eliminate the Bear's Enders, destroy their dwellings, and restore the primeval woodland, making a forest fit for elves to freely roam. The Lord of Bear's End was Oswin. Trouble with the elves had been brewing for some time, and Oswin had made sure his people were prepared. As the elves crossed the frontier, horns were sounded and messengers dispatched. Those farms in the path of the advancing elves were evacuated. Women and children congregated in Bear's End, where arrangements had been made to accommodate them. the menfolk armed themselves and assembled under Oswin's banner. The two forces met at the Battle of Green Grange. Eldaron took an arrow to the face, and Oswin won a famous victory. The elves retreated, and, for the moment at least, Bear's End was saved. Oswin was not strong enough to take the war to the elves. That meant they could recover their strength unmolested, and he fully expected their attack on Bear's End to be renewed sooner rather than later. The majority of the Bear's Enders had no armour, and as a result the elven longbows had wreaked merry havoc upon them. He therefore sent his uncle-in-law, Borkill, to negotiate with the dwarves of Svanheim, with a view to purchasing as many mail coats as the dwarves could provide. Now, the distance from Bear's End to Svanheim was 40 or so miles, most of which ran through elven territory. Borkill was therefore accompanied by 50 of Oswin's best men, on the basis that such a party was strong enough to deter an improvised attack by any elves they happened to encounter, yet nimble enough to traverse the territory before any more substantial elven force could be gathered and brought against them. Oswin's calculations were correct. His envoys passed through the forest unmolested, but they did not receive the welcome that Oswin and Borkill had hoped for. Svonlaug was at this time over 80 years old. She had ruled in Svanheim for 60 years, having led her people there after the fall of Dwarfbridge. She did not like strangers, and she did not wish to get involved in other people's affairs. She refused to trade with the Bear's Enders at any price. Borkill tried to change her mind. He reminded her of how her husband Orm had allied with Oswin's grandfather Grimbold, and how they had fought side by side in each other's cause. Surely that history of goodwill between Svonlaug's folk and those of Oswin still had some resonance with her. Svonlaug looked at him coldly. "Yes," she said, "that history still resonates with me. Thanks to that alliance, many dwarves and their wives and their children were slain. Thanks to that alliance, their homes were burned and their farms laid waste. Thanks to that alliance, Orm lost his life, I lost my husband, and my people lost their lord and their land. Yes, that history still resonates with me. I recall it every day, and I have no desire to relive it. I will not embroil my folk in your disputes. Now be gone." And so it was that Borkill returned to Bear's End empty-handed. Once again he traversed elven territory without encountering any resistance. But the movement of that many men was inevitably observed, and Eldaron drew his own conclusions. Now Eldaron knew something of the men of Bear's End, and very little of the dwarves of Svanheim. He rightly judged that the Bear's Enders were seeking assistance from the dwarves. He wrongly surmised that the dwarves had granted them that assistance, indeed that the dwarves had been providing such assistance for some time. Where else could the men of Bear's End have obtained arrows that could pierce elven mail, if not from the dwarves? Surely the arrow that had left such an ugly scar on his face had not been clumsily forged by some ignorant pig farmer, but cunningly wrought by dwarvish ingenuity. He became convinced that his attack on Bear's End had only failed because the dwarves had been supporting the Bear's Enders. Well, in that case, if he wanted to destroy Bear's End, he would first have to destroy Svanheim, and this he determined to do. But while Eldaron was convinced of the need to go to war with the dwarves, his fellow elves proved somewhat sceptical. Despite his eloquence, he could raise little enthusiasm for the enterprise. There was no real evidence that the dwarves were aiding and abetting the Bear's Enders. Indeed, all the elves' experience indicated that the dwarves were almost pathologically averse to getting involved in affairs beyond their borders. And there was nothing attractive to the elves in the high and desolate regions where the dwarves lived, certainly nothing to risk life and limb for. The majority of the elves preferred to leave the dwarves well alone. Common opinion held that Eldaron's injury had unbalanced his reason. But Eldaron was persistent, and ultimately his perseverance proved persuasive, at least to some of his listeners. He may not have garnered the mass public support that he had previously enjoyed, but he did manage to attract nearly 500 elven warriors to his cause, and in the 161st year of the Common Reckoning he led them into the mountains, marching towards Svanheim. Svonlaug learned of his coming and mustered her folk, placing them under the command of her grandson, Armod. When the elves reached Black Crag Pass, they found a host of grim-faced dwarves awaiting them. And so it was that high in the mountains a fierce battle was fought. The dwarves won the victory, and the shattered remnants of Eldaron's army were driven in disarray back to the forests from whence they came. That defeat destroyed Eldaron's credibility. Never again did the elves put weight upon his words or follow him to war. Of all his reversals of fortune, Eldaron found the loss of an eager audience the hardest to bear. He withdrew into solitary obscurity, roaming remote regions, reminding himself of the adversity and injustice he had suffered in an interminable muttered monologue. In the absence of his goading, for a time there was an uneasy peace between elves and dwarves and men in the lands to the north of the Twilight Mountains. But relations between the elves and the Bear's Enders remained frosty at best, and many dwarves had died at Black Crag Pass, and dwarves have long memories.